Hey everyone, what we're talking about right now is PAILs and R.A.I.Ls, and that's just an acronym from Kinstretch. It's something that is often really confusing and even intimidating for people when they first start working on their joints and their mobility using Kinstretch. So the first thing that we want to do is just define it. So PAILs stands for Progressive Angular Isometric Loading, and R.A.I.L stands for Regressive Angular Isometric Loading. The truth is, knowing what the acronym actually means doesn't really mean anything for you, so it's really not that big of a deal. What we want you to do is understand the concept. When we're talking about PAILs and R.A.I.Ls, it's an isometric protocol. That means that there's really not going to be any movement at all. You might see some movement on your R.A.I.Ls, but that's usually indicative of you not really being in your true end range. If you do see more than 15 degrees of movement on your R.A.I.Ls, the truth is you either set up a little bit wrong or maybe something didn't go right. So really keep that in mind. There really should not be a lot of movement at all. And most of the time it's an isometric where we're pushing into something and there is no movement, okay? The other thing that we want to consider is that your PAILs and R.A.I.Ls should always be done on a platform of stability. So it's not a balancing act. Anytime you can give yourself more leverage or you can find a different line of tissue, that's what we want. We don't want you to be balancing and unstable during PAILs and R.A.I.Ls at all. Another consideration is what is it doing? So like I said, it's expanding range of motion, but what's the mechanism behind that? Essentially, our bodies work with a stretch reflex. You can think about it similar to a governor on a car, where the car might be capable of going 160 miles per hour, but it actually stops at around 140. What we're doing with our bodies is learning how to communicate with our nervous system so that it lets us have that extra 20 degrees by showing strength. So I get into a position that feels like my end range, my stretch reflex holds me back, it says you can't go any further. From there, I create enough force in a specific manner to say, hey, you should let me go further. And then I'm allowed to actually pull myself deeper into the stretch with my R.A.I.Ls. Now that's a key consideration because PAILs and R.A.I.Ls is very different from contract and relax, or P&F if you're familiar with that. What we're doing is using the progressive side, which is the tissue that is stretching, and then we're using the antagonist or the opposite side to actually contract and pull us into the stretch. With the addition of R.A.I.Ls, we actually make the range of motion usable, meaning I actually contract the tissue that I'm going to use to go through that range of motion when I'm in dynamic movement, such as running, throwing, or any of the other things that you really want to do. Another key consideration with PAILs and R.A.I.Ls is it's just an isometric protocol that can be applied to any position. So oftentimes you'll think people, oh, that's not the right PAIL and R.A.I.L. Well, technically you could do it from any angle and you can do it from any position. So just know that you could eventually come up with your own variation of PAILs and R.A.I.Ls as long as it matches the intent and the goal of what you're trying to accomplish. When we are using PAILs and R.A.I.Ls, it's important to note that we're actually really training, not so much stretching. So it should be very intense. You're not going to get into a quality R.A.I.Ls contraction unless your PAILs contraction is very strong and it's very consistent throughout. We use ramping, so we're going to really ramp tension up, so you're both controlling the upregulation and downregulation of the tissue, and then we contract the opposite side. If you're keeping your PAILs on, you're not going to be able to access your R.A.I.Ls because they're just going to fight each other. So that control of actually turning off the first one and accessing the second one to pull you further is very important. Now that leads into the idea of really training new tissue. So when we talk about expanding range of motion or giving us more movement options, it allows us to actually train new tissue that our nervous system previously couldn't really access. So what that's going to do is not only give you some new soreness, but it's definitely going to be a process of really acclimating to that new tissue as well. Meaning, you don't want to open up a range of motion and then go full back squat for 500 pounds in your new 15 degrees of internal rotation. So we need to be considerate of the idea that this is new to you, and just like anything else, we should respect progressive overload and just try to ease into it and really go at a smart pace so that we don't overtrain at all. Lastly, another key consideration for PAILs and R.A.I.Ls is the idea that we need to be consistent. Oftentimes people will do 1, 2, maybe 3 sessions of PAILs and R.A.I.Ls, realize that they're starting to make some progress, and then just kind of forget about it. just like a lot of other training methods and approaches. But it's really important that you know that these changes are temporary until we lock them in with consistency. So there is no magic number of rounds. Maybe you started off with only 1 round of PAILs and R.A.I.Ls, but it's not unbelievable to think that you'd actually get to 3 rounds. Time under tension, as far as maybe spending 6 minutes in that same hip on that same side with multiple rounds and breathing in between, is a key consideration. We want to be consistent over the period of months, not even just weeks, not just days, but months, so that true change happens at the tissue level, at the joint level, and we're able to really have what we call cold mobility. Because the end goal is not to consistently do PAILs and R.A.I.Ls for the rest of your life, it's to open things up, own it, strengthen it, and really just have it when you wake up in the morning so that we're not constantly stretching and you can go on with your life in terms of doing all the things you love, whether that's yoga, biking, basketball, whatever sports you like, or even just classic strength training. This video is an example of our Kinstretch Pro tips that comes with our Elite Video membership. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.